So, okay. Why? So as part of my work that I do in banking and finance, I have a specialization in obviously normal banking and finance or general banking and finance, but also sustainable finance and financial services regulatory. So what's been really fascinating for me is my two interests have now converged, and sustainable finance is now filtering into regulation for the financial sector. And so it's a great opportunity for me to see the two pushing up against each other. Perhaps less exciting for people in the financial services sector, because already I think we feel that there's regulatory overload. Everybody's feeling a little bit, Barbara, sorry, would you click to the next one for me? So this picture sort of sums up, I think, how many people in the financial services sector feel, as if we're drowning in regulation. And it doesn't help that we've had a lot of draft regulation, not talking about sustainability now, just generally. We've had a lot of draft regulation over the last while to consider as professionals working in the space. Some of that draft regulation comes to nothing, it disappears. Some of it, like COFI, the Conduct of Financial Institutions Bill, has been on the cards for so long. Every time we think we can forget about it, it sort of rears its head again. And it makes it really difficult for financial institutions to plan, to forward plan as to what changes they actually need to make to business as usual in order to adapt to these regulatory changes that we see. So the amount of regulatory change in any event in the financial services space can be overwhelming. And when we look at it from a sustainability perspective, where we're dealing not just with regulation at home in South Africa, but also European legislation, which has an effect on us in South Africa, US developments that could have an effect on us, it becomes ridiculously overwhelming. I was at a conference a few weeks ago in London, and someone was trying to convey this idea. One of the speakers was trying to convey this idea to the audience about how much regulation there is. And she asked the gentleman to stand up, and he was taller than me. And she used him to illustrate, if she printed out all the regulation that is coming out of just Europe, it would have been taller in a paper stack than this gentleman that she asked to stand up. So that's like supposed to give us a real world view of what we're grappling with. So it's very easy to feel like you're drowning and like you can't cope with the regulation. But what I'm hoping to try and show you today is that you can think about this a bit differently. And Barbara, if you click to the next one for me, you can think about it more like this, like trying to actually get out of the quicksand and to be forward thinking enough to prepare for the regulatory onslaught that we are currently experiencing. So where are we currently? This is a table that was taken from the FSCA Statement of Sustainable Finance that they put out in 2023. They have already put out their 2024 one, and they intend to keep doing so annually to keep us all updated as to what they're thinking. But this was the 2023 statement was the first statement that our regulator made around what they think about sustainable finance and what they think their role as regulator is in respect of sustainable finance. Now, that's important for us in the financial services space because it gives us an indication of where policy is going and where regulatory change might come from. So it shows us, sort of spotlights for us, the areas that we need to focus on. And the FSCA divided their view of sustainable finance, and particularly what they needed to regulate, into these 5 pillars: taxonomy, disclosure, reporting and assurance, market development, active ownership, and consumer education. So to their minds, if they look at what the risk to financial consumers is in this space, those are the 5 pillars that they as a regulator will need to focus on and supervise and regulate in order to protect financial consumers. So the regulatory changes we see coming through will fit under one of those 5 pillars. And then if one looks at the rows that are at the bottom of their table, that indicates to us the way they think they're going to go about doing this. So they said first they're going to spend time building capacity because they acknowledge that within the regulator, like within many of the corporates, there wasn't enough technical knowledge around sustainable finance and these products to be able to regulate or supervise them properly. So initially they started out with capacity building, which is what they focused on last year and a bit of the year, and then research and stakeholder engagement. And what they did have done to date from a stakeholder engagement perspective is requests for information pushed out to different sectors of the financial sector. So credit rating agencies have been asked to fill in requests for information, and investment and asset managers have also been asked to feed back information to the regulator. So the focus has really been on those first 2 rows. And once they get through that, and they're still working on that, they'll move on to the next two rows. And obviously the third one is the most important for us as advisors, because that's where we're likely to see some policy or regulatory changes coming through. And then ultimately, obviously there is supposed to be coordination. We don't want the FSCA to be doing one thing and the PA to be doing another thing. So they are working quite hard at trying to remain coordinated. But even in the short space of time since this statement in 2023, there have already been developments that have popped up over the year that fit into these different pillars. So under the taxonomy, we already have a green finance taxonomy that our National Treasury put out in 2022. And that green finance taxonomy is still a little bit of a work in progress, in the sense that whilst it's final and it's been published, it's not complete. It doesn't cover all elements of green projects. It doesn't, for example, address social projects appropriately. It doesn't address transition projects appropriately yet, and it doesn't cover all sectors. But it gives an initial indication as to how we could classify projects as being green. And that becomes really important for financiers wanting to deploy sustainable finance, because without a taxonomy, you have to make your own judgment call as to whether something's green or not. You have to have internal frameworks to justify that. But being able to apply a taxonomy helps to make sure that you can, with integrity, say that we are actually allocating our capital to a green purpose. So the green finance taxonomy exists. It's not yet embedded properly into our financial sector, but it is something that the FSCA is quite interested in, as I'll show you on the next slide. Then sorry, Bob, just go back. Not really yet. Then under the disclosure reporting and assurance perspective, so in June last year, IFRS put out S1 and S2, which are their first two sustainability standards. Now, they're not IFRS accounting standards, so they're not, they don't plug in under the sort of mandatory accounting requirements, but they reflect the convergence of all of the voluntary global standards that existed up until that point. So what IFRS did was it took all of the existing voluntary standards, it analyzed all of them, and it used, I suppose, its presence as a overarching standard setter to pull that together and set these two standards, S1 and S2, which are supposed to guide reporters, corporates, to report on sustainability risk and climate risk. And the indication so far is that there is going to be widespread adoption of IFRS S1 and S2. Many countries have already indicated their support for these standards. At the moment in South Africa, we've got SAICA saying that they're on board with IFRS S1 and S2, and we've got the FSCA saying that they're going to put out a position paper on what they think about these two standards, but generally they have been accepted as being the new benchmark. So that's useful, because it means that when we do diligence in companies, we're looking at companies, we're trying to apply an ESG lens to the operations of companies, we now have a benchmark against which to do it, which is a globally accepted benchmark. And hopefully in future, those companies will be reporting against S1 and S2, so that information will just be readily available to us for due diligence purposes. Under market development, one of the things that the FSCA said they wish to do is to really help to bolster the carbon market. So last year, the JSE launched their voluntary carbon market, amidst a lot of fanfare and excitement. And the intention is that carbon credits will be able to be traded on that market, as well as renewable energy certificates. So that exists. The infrastructure is there, JSE is ready to trade. And from the FSCA's perspective, they are really interested in bolstering that and supporting that, because they believe that fostering efficient trade of credits within country, within South Africa, and externally offshore is really important in our just transition process. And then under the active ownership pillar, CRESA 2 was adopted or finalized. And CRESA 2, of course, sets out the renewed principles around stewardship and active ownership needs. Also voluntary, nothing is mandatory at this point, but institutions can choose to adopt CRESA and to follow that as the principles in their own engagement. Thanks, Barbara. So that was 2023. And in that 2023 statement on sustainable finance, the FSCA got quite granular and they actually put a work plan in place as to what they intended to do in each year and what regulatory changes they expected to make, which was quite exciting, because it meant that we could see, they're going to amend the code of conduct under phase to require financial advisors to talk to their clients about sustainability, which it's something I personally think really needs to happen. But in this 2024 statement, they've got a little bit less granular. So they've kind of stepped back a bit and they've said, actually, it's quite a lot of work to do. It's quite a lot to do under the capacity and stakeholder engagement portions. We're not quite ready to regulate just yet. So we're going to focus on the two pillars, the taxonomy, disclosure, reporting, and assurance. Because if we think about our role as a regulator, we can see that, yes, we have a vital role, but the most important thing for us is to be sure that the information that the market is getting is credible and consistent. The only way to do that is to have a classification system, the taxonomy, and then to start ensuring that people are reporting in a consistent way and that that information that they're reporting is credible. That's where the assurance pillar comes in. So that has been per their update of March 2024, that has been the focus. Sorry, Barbara, thank you. So I've taken the second pillar, the disclosure, reporting, and assurance pillar, and broken it down a bit further into a table, just to try and recap where we are and what developments we've seen and what are we likely to still see. So if we look at the corporate entity level, so that's when an actual corporate is going to make disclosures or report its own sustainability metrics, there has been development. As I said, there's IFRS S1 and S2, which gives us the benchmark. We know the JSE has put out sustainable disclosure guidance, which is guidance that came out just before IFRS S1 and S2 was finalized, but which was based on the early exposure drafts of IFRS S1 and S2. So it's not completely out of kilter, although it's not quite as up to date as S1 and S2. And when the JSE put that out, they said, we're not making it mandatory. We are not requiring all listed companies to use this disclosure guidance, but we're encouraging it. And we're actually encouraging all companies, not just the listed ones, to use this as a way of reporting. So that exists. Taxonomy exists, and the Prudential Authority has put out guidance to banks and insurers, indicating what they think banks and insurers should be doing as far as disclosure is concerned. So they've identified for banks and insurers what the risks are that they think those entities should be reporting to the market and what disclosures they should be making. So all of that is at a corporate level. And that's where most of the movement has been. And of course, that has knock-on consequences, because once we have credible and consistent reporting at the corporate level, then institutional investors who build portfolios can actually look at their portfolios and this information coming up at a portfolio level and then report on their portfolio holdings. So it will build as it goes on each other. Where we haven't yet seen a lot of development, but where in Europe there has been development, and it's likely to come here too, is at the product disclosure level. So that is when you create a financial product or you design a financial product for sale to your financial customers. At the moment in South Africa, we don't have any rules other than the normal rules that already exist around how that product is designed and the disclosures that are made in respect of that product. We know that under COFI, the principle is going to be, from a treating customers fairly perspective, that financial products must be designed for the target audience. So if you're designing a product, life insurance product that you're going to sell to a certain demographic, you must make sure that you've considered the risks and benefits for that demographic from a pricing perspective and from how that financial product is going to perform. So that's already in COFI. And once COFI is promulgated, that will be law. The extra piece that we're missing is whether, in so doing, you must think about the sustainability of that financial product and how it will perform going into the future for that target market that invests in that product. So in Europe, we've already got more disclosure guidance, but at a product level, where if someone sells a particular fund and says, this is a green fund, if you invest in it, you're using your capital for positive impact. In Europe, you can't say that unless you've ticked a whole lot of boxes. But we're not there yet, but we are going to go there. And in order to go there, we need the first pillar, the consistent, credible information out of the actual issuers. Because if a bank, for example, wants to sell a collective investment scheme to its customers, it needs to know that the underlyings meet certain criteria. And then finally, disclosure to retail investors. We've had some suggestion from the FSCA that they do see the role of financial services provider as the interface between the product supplier, the product house, and the customer they do see a role for the financial services provider in actually educating the customer, helping the customer to really understand what they're investing in. And from a sustainability perspective, that might mean discussing with the customer whether this green product is actually going to meet the customer's long-term aspirations, as well as perhaps moral imperatives in allocating their money in that way. But at the moment, there's no obligation there's no specific disclosures that have to be made to retail investors, but it's one of the pillars that the FSCA wishes to work on in the coming years. Thanks, Barbara. So I like to think about it from the perspective of the customer because it makes it a little bit more real. And essentially, all of us, even though we work for financial institutions or advisory companies or corporates, we are actually also in our own right financial customers. We all have our savings or our retirement funds or our debt products that we've taken out. We are all customers of financial institutions. And so if I look at what let's call it the nuisance is that the FSCA is seeking to regulate, what is it that the FSCA is worried about from a conduct perspective? These are the things that worry the FSCA if they look at it from a customer's perspective. They say, well, how will a customer ever know whether the financial product that's being sold to them is sustainable or not? How will the customer know if the bond or the green fund or the sustainable loan is actually doing what the financial institution is telling the customer it's going to do? If the customer can't tell that, how do they choose? And who's going to help them to choose? So that's the first point that the FSCA is trying to regulate for, and through those different pillars that we just talked about. The other point is that we don't know what we don't know. So customers don't know what questions to ask their advisors. Similarly, corporates face this problem too. Corporates don't necessarily know what risks they're missing when they apply their own risk analysis or their risk registers to their business. We're all quite comfortable with what the financial risks are that we should look at in a corporate context, as are investors comfortable in the due diligence they should do ordinarily when they're looking to make an investment. If you're going to invest in a financial product, you should look at what are the fees, what are the exit terms, does this suit my risk and reward requirements? That's sort of standard, but there are other things that we should be thinking about. One such thing is, if I invest in this particular financial product that has exposure to oil and gas, am I going to end up in 5 years' time, 6 years' time, 10 years' time, especially if I'm a very young financial customer and I'm only planning to retire in sort of 40 years, am I going to end up having my retirement savings exposed to a stranded asset, which is an asset that essentially just rapidly loses value because of the changing economic and societal times we find ourselves in? But a young financial customer coming to place their retirement savings for the first time might not know to ask that question, and that's something that concerns us here. And then seeing the wood for the trees, because without this consistent, credible information about these financial products, how do any of us make any decisions at all? So if we can get consistent, credible information, if we can have regulation that governs how products are described and sold, then we can guard against the risk that vulnerable consumers suffer mis-selling and that TCF outcomes are perhaps not achieved. And finally, apples and oranges. We want to be comparing apples with apples. And we know in the financial services sector that already a lot of work's been done just to try and get fees to be comparable across different financial products. Now, similarly, there will be work done to try and ensure that claims around sustainability or impact or green or purpose-led money, that those claims are comparable. Thanks, Barbara. So where do we go? So the FSCA has said that they will continue to encourage the voluntary adoption of the green finance taxonomy because they do think it's an important tool. So that's going to be their focus from 2024 to 2026. So that tells us we don't have to worry about the green finance taxonomy becoming mandatory before 2026, which is a relief, particularly to banks, because you wouldn't want to have to suddenly report on your taxonomic alignment of your portfolios. That would be quite a big project to be able to do that. But we do know that that's the direction of travel. The FSCA is indicating to us that they, and actually the Prudential Authority too, in their guidance, is indicating to us that they are likely to require that in future, albeit not the immediate future. They also have indicated that they do see the green finance taxonomy as being an important tool to draw international money and to allocate capital appropriately. So the LMA, the Loan Markets Association, as some of you will know, have got principles that they apply when to try and classify whether something's a green loan, a social loan, or a sustainability linked loan. And in those principles, those principles are global, so they apply in different jurisdictions. But they've made the comment that if in your jurisdiction in which you're applying our principles, there is a taxonomy, you should be thinking about using that taxonomy to work out your eligibility criteria. So to work out whether something's green, social, you should use your taxonomy to do that. You shouldn't make up new rules to do that. So that's further endorsement of the concept of using the taxonomy. Thanks, Barbara. And then finally, on the disclosure point. So as I said, IFRS F1 and S2 have been around now since June last year, so coming up a year. And there's been a lot of talk about adoption, and some corporates have done early adoption, and they've started trying to report against S1 and S2. And what we can see from both the Prudential Authority in their guidance and the JSE in their disclosure guidance, the intention is that there should be disclosure against this international benchmark. And what the FSA has said is that the Prudential Authority has already said that in respect of banks and insurers. The Prudential Authority has already indicated that it wants banks and insurers to make these disclosures against climate and sustainability. And we as the FSCA are going to also issue guidance to require that of non-bank and non-insurance financial institutions. So that is interesting because I don't quite know how a small financial services provider is going to cope with that. But that again is the direction of travel that the FSCA is going in. They will start, they say, with retirement funds, which makes complete sense because retirement funds actually since 2011 have been required to take ESG factors into account in their investment decision-making process. And they were reminded by their regulator again in 2019 that it should be part of their investment policy statements. They should be explaining to their members if they made an investment that falls outside of ESG criteria. So they will be the focus of the FSCA initially, but then the FSCA will branch out to other non-bank and non-insurance financial institutions. We can expect a joint standard on culture and governance, which is something that's been in the works for a while, but we're waiting for a draft. Might be held up by COFI, maybe, because a lot of the governance and culture principles sit in COFI, which is still draft. A part of me thought COFI might quickly get signed into law before the election, but given that we know
we're busy with NHI.
NHI and the electricity amendments, so there was a little bit too much on the go. So COFI's back on the back burner, but I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens with the elections and the aftermath to see when we're going to get COFI. But the FSCA said recently in a press release, COFI is not dead. COFI is coming, just hang in there. So we all see. And we've given up doing roadshows about COFI because clients just laughing at us now, talking about draft legislation from 2020. But anyway. And then, as I said, product level disclosure, that's going to be quite a big thing. And I think that's going to be linked to COFI because already COFI, when it's published, promulgated, is going to require product design teams within financial institutions to take a whole lot of stuff into account that they've not previously taken into account when developing financial products. So that's already going to expand the work of those product supply teams. And so it makes sense to product supplier development teams. So it makes sense to, if you are going to need product disclosure at the product level, to do that at the same time as you require those teams to develop themselves out. So that's something that we're watching. Quite sure of the direction of travel on that one, but on the previous 2 points, I think it's quite clear. Barbara, thanks. So I'll leave you with this tagline to think about.
Working now? Yeah, okay. So who are you wearing? Fashion and sustainable fashion in particular. As Jess said, we had a wonderful event last month, and the reason why it happened in April was because it was Fashion Revolution Month. There were actually quite a few days that were quite significant to the fashion industry. Earth Day was also in there. I think Workers' Day was there from a South African perspective. But Fashion Week it's about a week or at least a week's worth of activism, which was started by an organization in England. And it followed a really bad tragedy in, I think it was about 2013. So it was the 10-year anniversary of all of the mobilization of activism, but 11 years after the Rana Plaza disaster. I'm not sure how many of you know about it, but it's a factory in Bangladesh. There were around, I think, 1,200 people who died because in this particular factory, there were safety concerns. And although the garment workers raised these safety concerns, they were just ignored. And after the collapse of the building, what was found as well were garments made by all of the world's a lot of fast fashion brands and just big fashion brands like H&M and Zara and I think Adidas. And it just showed that there were a number of companies who were having products made in Bangladesh where the safety of workers was not protected. And so the industry got a lot of backlash, just trying to, not just turn a blind eye and not care about who's making their clothes. And it also shone a light on the supply chain in fashion. And so with that, I'm going to start with something a bit different. But as just said, I'm Carlin for Teddy Davies. I also have an Instagram page called Conscious Carlin, where I try and focus on local brands. So local fashion, which is one of the easiest ways to be sustainable. And I'm going to start with something a little bit different. I want you all to close your eyes, and we're going to do 2 visualizations. You don't have to close your eyes, but just think about what I'm telling you about. So the first thing is think about when you feel most confident, most calm, and just you feel really, really good. What do you see? What do you hear? What are you feeling? Most importantly, what are you wearing? Think of a particular thing. Okay, once you have that image in your mind, then I'm going to send you on a mission to your nearest shopping center or your favorite shopping center, whatever that might be. You have to grab a quick lunch. So take away something that will take about 10 to 15 minutes. And while you wait, instead of waiting, you decide to go and check a jacket that is on your list for winter. It doesn't get so cold here. So maybe a light little, what are they called, filet with no arms. And on your way, you see a store having a sale with a pair of tacky sneakers, trainers, whatever you want to call them, that you've had your eye on. You run in quickly, you find your size, you buy the pair, and you head to the next shop. And when you get there to look for this jacket, they don't have your size. The assistant is very slow to assist you, but they go and they find where else the other stores that might stock your size. And then you realize you're running late. So you rush back through the mall to go and get your takeaway food, go and pay your parking ticket if you have to. Hopefully that's not such a thing here either. And then you realize you're running late for your next meeting or an online call that you are about to miss. And then open your eyes and then take a deep breath. As I said yesterday, put your lungs into it. Deep breath. Okay. Thank you. And so what I wanted to achieve with those 2 visualizations, the first one is what the fashion industry has always been known for. What we think about is the end product, what we wear, how we feel, and it's often something that releases when you're buying. It's actually before a purchase that all of the hormones are released in your mind, the excitement, the adrenaline, happiness, all of those centers in your brain are activated. And to wearing your clothes, hopefully that also makes you feel really good. And there's about 80 years worth of research into social science, psychology, advertising, marketing, that all goes behind the fashion industry in order to sell their products. So that's why it's such a feel-good, maybe superficial industry. Whereas when we look at the actual supply chain, which I'm going to get to, that's pretty overwhelming. That's actually the journey of an item of clothing. And so the second visualization, I wanted you to feel a bit overwhelmed, not so great, not so calm, but maybe for the moms, they're used to juggling and racing around. But essentially, our clothes go through such a process. And it starts, as Jess said, what's really interesting about the fashion industry is that it crosses multiple sectors within one sector. So you actually start with agriculture or chemicals. Polyester, after all, is plastic. It comes from fossil fuels. And then you go to spinning and weaving of your actual fibers, to dyeing, washing. There's a lot of washing. So fashion is heavy on water use. Transportation, then, as we know, there are whole supporting sectors like marketing and the fashion industry, photography, that all support the fashion industry. And then you go to the more environmental side, hopefully, or more sustainable side with clothing swaps, which starting to gain a bit of traction here. And hopefully you're repairing your clothes, but ultimately clothes go to landfills. And that is another negative impact of the fashion industry. A lot of South American countries, African countries are donated clothes and it's sent to their landfills, and ultimately it's far cheaper for the global north to send what they have overproduced to African countries and South American countries than rather dealing with the waste in their own countries. And I think there's scary facts like some fashion brands will only sell 30% of what they produce. And the whole reason why they produce such a large number is because the garment workers are essentially subsidizing the industry. So as much, while you try and push your numbers up, you reduce the price of your items, and then your employees, that's the only expense that you can really negotiate. So that's why fast fashion retailers are known to pay 3 cents an item. Workers for Shein, for example, are working 18 to 22 hours a day. They have 1 day off a month. So there's vast abuse just with the workers. And so to move away from this type of system that is really complex, and also because it's got so many different parts, you might produce cotton in India, send the cotton to another country to be finished, then manufactured somewhere else, and then it's finally sold across the world. So it dots across different jurisdictions. Everyone has different types of laws for workers' protection, for environmental impacts. So it's a big mess. So we'd rather move to a system like this. And this is what sustainability is trying to achieve. A simpler system where you have a little bit more of a closed loop. It doesn't look that much more simple, but the easiest way to achieve something like that is also to have local production and to buy locally. So you cut down on the crisscrossing into different jurisdictions, transportation, that type of thing. And ultimately, I like this sort of summary of how the fashion industry needs to change. So it's put into this perspective. It's to break the model of a linear economy, which is just extraction, manufacturing, consuming, and throwing away, to something that is more circular, that's based on eco-design of products, responsible consumption, extension of shelf life, recycling of products, and waste. And this is true to so many industries. We're trying to move away from just create products and then make the consumers deal with it. And so a lot of the principles, the good news is that there is change. And I'm going to focus on Europe and all of the legislation. Just as Jess said, the amount of legislation that there is astounding. And just looking at the fashion sector, again, as an example to see what changes are coming through, it's based on a lot of the SDGs, sustainable SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. And in particular, the 12th goal is important for the fashion industry, which deals with responsible consumption and production. And as I said, it's an interesting industry because the overproduction often fuels overconsumption. But we see that a lot of the high-income countries have more of an impact than the low-income countries. And it's almost the global south becomes a dumping ground for the overconsumption of the north. And I am so afraid and so scared that Africa will follow suit. We have one of the biggest youth demographics. And once the youth gain access to, once they start working and they have more economic power, if we follow the north and just buy and throw away culture, pretty much doomed. And it's going to be really difficult to gain traction back. And so what the SDG goals do, and this then flows further into more legislation, which this is the serious legal part that I'm going to get to. So to take Europe as an example, and the EU Green Deal, which hopefully many of you have heard about, that just aims for Europe to be the first carbon neutral continent by 2050. And in order to do that, they have about 8 to 9 different programs and plans. And then within those programs and plans, there are further pieces of legislation. And then obviously each member state will domesticate that regulation. So if we start from the Circular Economy Action Plan, which was launched in March 2020, and what that aims to do is to essentially bring the circular economy into Europe, and it promotes sustainable production and consumption patterns, encourages resource efficiency, and aims to reduce waste generation. And so the main aim also, as I already mentioned, focuses on eco-design. So designing products so that there is less waste and it just keeps sort of moving around. But in order to do that, you need good quality. And then to move on further, it also deals with just the reduction of hazardous chemicals. And although we don't know it, a lot of clothes have heavy chemicals. Chemicals used just to soften materials, to dye materials. And I think there was even a case where they found lead in children's clothing. So it's quite worrying. Then on the other extreme of the spectrum, there are also people believe that clothes have energy and it can contribute negatively to your overall health because skin is the biggest organ of the body. So what you wear can really impact your overall health. There are a few documentaries that are coming out, but it is sort of the other extreme, but interesting. And then flowing from that, then when we see the actual regulation, because that's again an action plan, moving into some strategies, the EU chemical strategy deals with hazardous chemicals and the use of those, trying to make it safer if it has to be used, but preferably using alternative chemicals that are less harmful. And just an example like that, where you have Italy, who is known for their luxury shoes. They are concerned about the fact that the glue that they use in their shoes, they'll have to find an alternative, something that's not hazardous, and that could really become a very big disruptor to their industry alone. So with a number of these pieces of legislation, the ripple effect is quite big. Then if we moved on to the EU textile strategy again, that strategy again, all of these are very similar, and they mainly aim to have things that are more efficient, reduce environmental impact, and the part that I like, foster innovation. So moving away from things like leather and finding mushroom leather and mango leather and all these interesting new materials. I also saw recently that they've managed to design a biodegradable polyester. So they mix them, I think it's bio products in with polyester, and it's not as quick as natural fibers, but the polyester can still break down. So a lot of smart people also have the opportunity to make a lot of money in making these alternatives. And with the textiles, the other interesting thing that I found, they had a textile exchange conference last year, and the highlight, or what they took from it, was that a demand for sustainable raw materials is expected to exceed supply by 133 million tons by 2030. So that's massive. And so what they focus on is they say that swiftly securing access to sustainable raw materials could boost the average net profits by 6%, while simultaneously reducing carbon emissions. So it's again something that we see quite often with ESG. It's doing good, can also still result in profits. And South Africa, for example, has great supply of merino wool and also mohair. And so focusing on industries like that and actually building it, rather what's happened in the past is we just produce the wool, send it overseas to be beneficiated, and then buy the items back. So we need to build our own industries to keep that, especially when there's money to be made. And then the next one is the EU product environmental footprint and organization environmental footprint. Quite a mouthful. But what this does is it provides methodologies to assess all of the requirements in these other strategies. So to set the standard, to ensure that companies are complying with the legislation that comes into place, and to track that they are sticking to those requirements. And then the eco-design for sustainable products, again, that just focuses on all of the things I've mentioned already. There's a lot of abilities, so it's moving away from things that are just throwing away, and things are able to be reused, recycled, and that type of thing. So again, just designing a product so that you aren't throwing it away. Okay. And then what they're going to do specifically with the eco design, and this is another thing that industries are worried about just because it's going to change how they make products, is that they're going to focus on particular products or industries by 2030, textiles being one of them. So they'll have their high priority lists first, and then the legislation will come in for eco design. And I think specifically, again, Italy was very concerned about their shoemaking because it's leather, and leather has a massive impact. So a lot of disruptors to the industry. And then the last one that I wanted to mention, which I'm sure you've heard Jess and my colleagues speak about a lot, is the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And so that's where we are moving away from only financial reporting to non-financial reporting. And it's sort of encapsulated by the CS-DDD or the CS3D, where companies are going to have to start doing due diligences of their entire supply chain. And the fashion industry is extremely complex. And one of the issues, or one of the things that will become really important, is data collection. And often the focus on local designers is because that supply chain is so much shorter, and the ability to do your due diligence on your supply chain is a lot easier. If you're an international company and you have to dot across the world into different jurisdictions and start laying the basis for your due diligence, it's quite difficult. But that is going to become the norm, and companies are going to have to provide that information for their suppliers. Okay, and then I wanted to touch on France. I have 3 more minutes, so I must go a bit quicker. But France are leading the charge, mainly because they have to protect their luxury industry. They are arguably the home of couture, and the fast fashion industry is having a huge impact on them. And so they've started a few initiatives and regulations, like the anti-waste for a circular economy. That again just traces very similar to the strategies and the regulations that I've mentioned. It just follows, and it requires companies to report things on their environmental impact, their worker impact. And also the interesting thing for me is that they're going to have to start focusing on their labels, not just simply saying where the item was made and care instructions, but actually tracing and reporting on environmental impacts, recyclability. The one I find interesting is the release of plastic microfibers. So they'll have to note exactly what percentage of microfibers will be released from their clothes. And all of this is aimed at providing more information to consumers so that they can make informed decisions about the clothing, while also holding the companies to task so that they start acknowledging the impacts that they have. Okay, and then the subsidies for repairs I also find really interesting. So last November, companies, well, individuals can get a subsidy to mend their shoes or their clothes. So France is really trying to make people think a lot more about their clothing rather than just buying something new. And then lastly, a very hot topic that came into the media recently is the anti-fast fashion bill. So France is trying to charge consumers £5, between 5 to 10 euros, sorry, on each item that is bought from a fast fashion brand. And then they're also going to give €5 back to people who support local or sustainable brands. So again, the impact of fast fashion on their luxury brands is quite big, but it's interesting because it's quite a protectionist attitude. Some luxury brands have been known to produce their items in the same factories as fast fashion. So it's just interesting to see the debates. And I think Shein came back to France and said, well, you're just going to make your people suffer because they don't have the money to buy luxury brands or sustainable brands, and they are going to suffer, not us. So it's quite interesting. But what does this all mean for South Africa? So the point, though, is a lot of legislation. Things are going to change, and we can't continue as is. And so for South Africa, if we are exporting our clothes, our merino wool, that type of thing overseas to Europe, we're going to have to do those due diligences and know our supply chain quite well. So all of that type of information, the due diligence questions, we're going to have to start asking. And it also means that there are transition risks with that. So
Ireland is the only speaker I don't have to regulate.
During our event last month, I had to regulate people, and I'm terrible at it. So I don't want to be one of those. But yes, so what we're also going to have to do with transition risks, and just as Jess was saying, so this is almost the starting point of the information that would be built in so that products can be reported on, so that you know the actual impacts of the industry or the sector or the company. And so the information is really important, and internal due diligence are going to grow. And those due diligences, we're used to them obviously in mergers and acquisitions, but going down to a supplier level, I think will be quite difficult because often companies, especially in the fashion industry, just take what they can get and they don't ask questions. So it'll be interesting to see that develop. And then from a broader perspective, even with the Green Deal, the EU is going to start investigating companies that use fossil fuels, and they're trying to move away so that they can ensure that their products are more sustainable. So that might have a very big impact on African companies. And just to give you some comforts from a South African perspective, our legislation is really good. So as we know, our workers are protected quite well. That sometimes makes it difficult for entrepreneurs, but at least we know our garment workers are being paid at least a minimum wage. Some companies pay a living wage, but it's a start. We know that the abuse is not non-existent, but just far less. And then from an environmental perspective, we also have really good environmental laws, which I won't bore you with. But our authorities have been focusing on the mining industry, industrial companies, so they haven't really shifted to fashion companies yet. So it'll be interesting to see when they do. And even simple things like I hear often that even our retailers will import clothes from overseas, cut the labels out, and sew in made in South Africa labels. So I'm waiting for the authorities to even just start investigating that. And then there's no specific fashion related legislation at this point. But what we do see is things like the master plan, where our big retailers like Mr. Price, Pick and Pay Clothing, Fashini's, True Words have agreed with government to start producing locally up to 65% by 2030. So that's quite big. And then SMMEs, not so much. They're kind of ignored, which is a great pity. And that was the point of our event last month, where we got designers who are typically our SMMEs just to give them legal support, because they are the future Tebe Magugus or Sandiso Kumalos of tomorrow, and they can really make a lot of money. So it's a gap, certainly, that they aren't being focused on. And the master plan also then deals with imports, and they're saying they're trying to stop illegal imports. And there's been a battle even with Shein. I think they tried to increase taxes because they try and avoid taxes in South Africa by sending one item at a time. So the authorities are aware of the impacts and they're trying to make a change. And then existing practices, why it's quite interesting when I try to find more information about the sustainability of Africa, it's not really there because it's just an everyday practice. So we have a lot of traditional craftsmanship. Hand-me-down is just something we've always grown up with. And our informal secondhand economy is quite big as well. So I would be very surprised if any of you have ever worn something 3 to 7 times. I see different statistics, and then literally throw it in the dustbin, send it to a landfill. That I still can't get over that, just as something that people do. So I think we're still quite conservative and hopefully not going where the North is already. And then to pull it back to what Jess was also mentioning, just on our actual standards. So when we do our due diligences, these are the type of questions and items that a fashion brand would have to look at to build that data and that information that will be used to report. It will go all the way up. So it's things like raw materials and the sourcing of that from an environmental to a social perspective, and standards and certifications, which we don't have in Africa. A lot of the certifications and standards are all from overseas. They're very expensive for companies to comply with. Sealand, one of our, it's almost like the Patagonia of South Africa, they have even tried to comply with certifications, and it's very expensive. So there's, again, a gap for Africa and certification. And then looking at chemicals, which I've already mentioned, that's something that companies will have to do due diligence on. What are the risks? What are they dealing with? And maybe can they find alternatives? Labor conditions, again, we're not too bad to our labor, thankfully. And finally, just all of the impacts that that whole supply chain has. It's things like energy, water, wastewater, air emissions, chemicals management. So it really is almost all the impacts that you can think of from an environmental perspective comes from one sector. And so, yeah, those are just a highlight of the gaps that I mentioned: data collection, local audits, local certification, and also protection of our fashion sector. Just building the capacity to support local and produce products that can be sold overseas. So that's it. Who are you wearing? So when you thought at the beginning about your favorite thing, also think about who you're wearing. Are you wearing outfits that maybe have, this is very dramatic, but tears and hand sewn notes saying "help me" from overseas, which literally has happened? Or are you wearing clothes that were made locally and you know you're supporting an entire family and an entire community? And I just want to start with, who knows what biodiversity actually is? Anyone want to try? No? Okay, fine. I'll tell you. You want to hear some moments?
Yeah.
No,
No, you're right.
yeah.
I was going to say, I thought he just was all the living organisms on the plant and land.
Exactly.
It's a
So,
comprehension question.
yeah.
Listening comprehension.
Totally. So exactly, it's the foundation of our living world. Biodiversity is crucial for food, energy, air quality, soil, and climate. So yeah, it's exactly that. It's everything that we need to exist on the planet. And why it is so interesting is because for the most part, we've just been speaking about climate. And I think Manso also did a great job of showing how climate has stolen the limelight, notably, obviously, for good reason. But now it's also laid a great foundation for biodiversity, and just what Jess was mentioning, and how it's going to change, and companies are going to have to start focusing on biodiversity. So shifting from climate to biodiversity. So here we see, I don't know if anyone recognizes or has seen or knows about what the 9 planetary boundaries are. So essentially, it's a way that scientists, there are about, I think, 27 of them, came together and did a study and determined what we need to survive on planet Earth. And they highlighted 9 topics or 9 areas that keep the planet going, essentially. And prior to, obviously, the human evolution, the planet went through a lot of extinctions and changes, ice ages, and all of those types of things. A great program to watch is Life on Our Planet by Morgan Freeman. It's incredible. Like, they do such a good job of tracing back evolution and bring it to our current situation with biodiversity changes. And his voice is just so nice to listen to. And so what they say, so they've been tracing these 9 planetary boundaries over the years, and unfortunately things are just getting worse, as you can see. So once we exceed them, what it means, and so it's things like climate change, which we just mentioned, land system change, freshwater use, biochemical flows, ocean acidification, atmospheric erosion, aerosol loading, stratospheric ozone, and that one is novel entities. So once we exceed these boundaries, then it just means that we're going to have more extreme weather events, ecosystem damage, that type of thing. And it's just going to be harder for us to essentially survive and live good lives. And so bringing it back to biodiversity, and a lot of people don't really think about it. And so you're probably wondering, what is the problem really, or why are we seeing these changes so drastically? And essentially, it's the acceleration of the global economy over the last 70 years. So it's great that the planet kind of plateaued and it was easy to live on, and now we've just kind of pushed it a little bit too far. And we're making things happen a lot quicker. And I think climate change as well is a perfect example. A lot of denying that it exists, and now I think it's a fairly established fact that we are definitely doing something to make things change quicker than it should. And so as Mansoor went over, we have the climate change and basically the Paris Agreement, which I'm sure you've all heard about. That's the basis of our climate change legislation. And there is a similar piece of legislation for biodiversity known as the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, or the GBF. So that's what I'm going to refer to. And so 196 countries signed that. And I think it really helps that climate change has come so far. Biodiversity is just the next big thing to focus on, and South Africa signed it as well. So with the signing of this document, it means, again, just like we've seen in climate change, that there are going to be regulations and products and changes. And the title of the presentation is Shifting from First Gear. And what we believe is that the fact that we have the climate change legislation, biodiversity is already sort of going to move quicker, which is great news. And so to give an example of just what all of these things mean to make it a little bit more tangible, the reports say that about 25% of species that have been assessed for animals and plants are threatened, and around 1 million species already face extinction. So as I said, this has happened over the years, but the acceleration of species loss and changes has definitely accelerated. And what this actually means is that although we don't acknowledge it, companies, some more than others, rely on biodiversity and ecosystems to exist. And so there was an interesting assessment done by PwC, and they monitored to see how many companies actually rely on ecosystems and biodiversity. And they came out with 163 sectors analyzed, all have or rely on biodiversity within their value chain. So that's massive. And they found that the health of natural ecosystems and biodiversity have far-reaching implications. And more than half the markets of the value of listed companies over 19 different stock exchanges, so that's across the world, will be impacted. And another number, they say that the research done by the European Central Bank says that 72% of their European countries are dependent on at least one of nature's services, and that these findings are likely to be relevant to many jurisdictions. And so to give you an example, when you think about it, because you don't always think about biodiversity as being part of a company, but something as simple as food. So we know that animal pollinators are essential to the growth of food. And it's as high as 35% of the world's food crops depend on animal pollinators. So that's 1 in every 3 bites you take. Once those pollinators, like bees, there's been a lot in the news about bee species almost being wiped out due to pesticides and various things. Once those disappear, we're going to have to manually pollinate food. And that will just increase prices, and it will make a lot of food production unviable, impacting agriculture and food and beverage industries. Another important one, coffee, which I'm sure many of us really appreciate having, and I've read a lot of reports about this, that coffee production is also declining. And they say it accounts for 75% of the world's Arabica coffee supply is going to be impacted by the change in ecosystems due to things like soil degradation, diseases, and hotter temperatures due to climate change. So these are just 2 examples of real impacts that can impact entire industries. And then another scary fact, which this one you can visualize, is that a report by the World Resources Institute stated that in 2023, we lost the equivalent of 10 soccer fields of tropical primary forest per minute globally in a period of 1 year. So yeah, so that just shows all of these sort of charts. You can picture 10 soccer fields. That's massive, a minute. So that's what we're dealing with. Very depressing. But as with my previous presentation, there is some good news. And so again, going from climate change, they are flowing from the GFB as well, there are things that are going to change and hopefully prevent the acceleration or the worsening of biodiversity loss. And another thing that's also interesting, these companies that rely on the services from the environment and who have risks, dependencies, and impacts on the industries, their businesses are actually overvalued because they're not taking these risks into consideration. So some of the things that we can look to, and we've already, this is just the theory fact, already gone through. It's behind on my slides. Okay, but so the things that we can track and where it is changing, and hopefully corporates can get involved, things like disclosures, which we've already discussed. So companies are going to have to report on their dependencies, the risks, and the impacts associated with these nature systems. And thankfully, there are already existing platforms that can be used to disclose against these things. Again, at the moment, it's voluntary, so it's not mandatory yet, but it's the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or the TNFD. So that is similar, you would have heard of the TCFD, which is, I'm going to have to read it again. It's the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So again, as I said, we're seeing that as piggybacking off of climate change. And so that framework was released quite recently, and it's for nature-related disclosures. It was just September last year that it was released, so it's quite recent. And so then disclosing obviously will allow for greater transparency, and again, the data collection and just knowing what risks are related so that investors are better equipped. Okay. And there are a few examples. An interesting one that we came across recently, an increase just on reporting, at least from a climate perspective. We saw that shareholder activism is increasing, and I think, is there still a session on shareholder? Yeah, so
Right up next.
yeah, so not to steal your thunder, but maybe also to lead nicely into it. So there have been resolutions that have been brought requiring companies to provide disclosures on nature-related aspects, like Starbucks, PepsiCo, Kellogg's, or Killanova now. They've all been the subject of filings from this perspective. So it's definitely it's catching up to a place where you can't ignore these impacts anymore. Okay, so I'm going to skip to how much time? How am I for time?
3 minutes.
Okay, yes. Let me go quickly. So disclosures, then directors' duty. That's another important one. And there was an opinion released, and although we can't rely on the opinion because it's obviously based in England and Wales, it gives us a good basis to see that directors, it's going to be part of their fiduciary duty to know about the related risks based on biodiversity. So that opinion just lays a foundation for the fact that directors can't ignore all of these impacts and their reliance on ecosystems. And then emerging biodiversity economy. This is also another interesting one. So similar to climate change, buying carbon credits, there is hopefully going to be a similar system for biodiversity. And so when it actually started, I think they say 19, so it's target 19 of the GFB provides that in order to halt extinction, we have to have an additional 700 billion per year dedicated to safeguard biodiversity and conserve ecosystems. So that's a large number, and about 500 million per year will be raised, and that will be achieved by phasing out harmful subsidies. So it's quite an interesting concept to weed out subsidies that are not assisting. And one example I can think of, obviously subsidizing fossil fuels and the oil system, oil companies. And so there's still a shortfall of 200 billion per year. And about February this year, there was just over 214 billion of the million, 214 million had been raised. But the requirement is 200 billion. So it's woefully inadequate. So there are some challenges, but hopefully with the movement and the voluntary biodiversity credit markets, that will assist. So as I said, similar to carbon credits, it's likely that we'll have biodiversity credit markets. And when it started, there was quite a large amount of supply side. So lots of companies jumping on board, having projects that can support a credit system. But obviously, as Jess was just saying, there's a lack from the actual buy side. So once it is legislated and it's not just we're doing these good projects, then I think there will be some uptake from the corporate side. So it's there and there are projects available, just as Jess said, but I think we just have to wait for the system to mature a little bit more. Okay, and so then in South Africa, also another interesting change. I don't think Mansour mentioned it. He went into a lot more detail, which was great. I'm kind of more of a bird's eye view, but we had, from a South African perspective, the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment published a draft document, the National Biodiversity Economy Strategy. So they're already thinking ahead and thinking of things like credit markets. So it's just a strategy, but at least we have something in place and the department is on board. And particularly, I think the stats I read, although South Africa only takes up 2% of the world's land mass, we hold, I think, 10% of the world's biodiversity. So that's massive, and it's something that we really need to protect. And then there are benefits with projects for biodiversity credits. Okay. And then the last one, which I've already gone through to an extent from my previous presentation, is the supply chain risk. And again, that we see it's common throughout all of the ESG regulation. And what's happening there is that companies are having to note, obviously, through their due diligences, their biodiversity impacts. And a great example is the EU deforestation regulation, which is due to come into operation this December, so it's quite soon. And just as Jess was saying, what will happen here is companies will have to confirm that any of the supply for their products has not been taken from any areas that where deforestation has taken place. And that's quite massive. And even the fashion industry, I think, is largely responsible for a lot of deforestation, which you wouldn't think about, but viscose, rayon, ecovero, tencel, all pretty much the same material. It comes from wood pulp. So they actually need forests in order to create those fabrics. And it's argued that it's a mix of synthetic and natural fibers. But that's a good example where I think recently a big company was taken to task for deforestation. I want to say it was Zara, but I might be wrong. So companies are going to have to disclose against that. And already Australia has said, no, please don't put this into operation in December yet, slow down. So it is being fought against. I think that is one more, let me see. Yeah, no, I don't have a final. Okay, but I thought there was actually. Sorry, I'm just going to go back to see if I missed it. No. Okay, but anyway, I'll just tell you anyway. So the World Economic Forum's risk report for 2024 relating to risks for biodiversity loss and the impact, they say that, yeah, there was meant to be one, that it's basically a page that just lists the risks from the World Economic Forum based on companies. And I think climate change, then next is natural disasters, the increase. And the third item that is listed is biodiversity and the critical change to ecosystems. So that's why it's the next issue that we're going to have to grapple with and deal with. But as we said, at least we have a basis to follow with climate change. And so we're not really that far behind, but it will be really interesting to see how quickly it develops just off the back of climate change. That's it. Thank you, Fanny.
Ladies and gents, thanks for coming today. I am a senior associate in the disputes and insolvency department here in Durban. So as Jess said, we're going to be talking about Exxon and the shareholders dispute. So let's just get into it. I'm going to just focus on the actual factual basis that's transpired in the US, and then Adam will take us through the sort of similarities in terms of South African law and whether the implications that one must be concerned with. So Exxon is one of the 5 major oil and gas companies in the world, and they have their base in Houston, Texas. So in preparation for their annual general meeting in 2024, two of their shareholders, as Carla mentioned, shareholder activism, they are shareholder activists, proposed that Exxon establishes targets for Scope 3 emissions, which Monsieur mentioned earlier. So that's to reduce their carbon footprint. But the Scope 3 really relates to indirectly generated carbon emissions. So just in terms of what a shareholder activist is, it's typically a non-profit organization, and their purpose is to urge and encourage large corporations and organizations to drive towards change in terms of climate change. And the purpose of owning the shares in those entities is that they can have sort of influence in doing so. Some people would classify them as quite radical, and others are there for a good purpose. So currently Exxon, and it's quite interesting because out of the 5 oil giants, Exxon's the only one that doesn't have Scope 3 objectives, but it's got its net zero objectives for Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, which is set to be concluded by 2050. And this is not the first time that these shareholder activists have proposed this Scope 3 emission target for them. It has historically been proposed and it received less than 10% shareholder support. So Exxon's board of directors decided that they were going to go to the district court in Texas, and they wanted a declarator in terms of whether these shareholder activists could table this proposal. And the 2 major factors that they relied on were, firstly, that it's repetitive because it has historically been proposed and not supported by a very small minority. And then the other one, and the sort of more legal foundation, is that their view is that the shareholders' influence or the shareholders' proposal encouraged on the board or the company's management, and it's ordinary business and how it does things. After Exxon brought its application to the court, the shareholder activists decided that they were going to withdraw their proposal. One would then assume that the matter can then sort of end and then AGM can continue and everything should be fine. But Exxon said no. They want to continue with their application. Even though it had previously been rejected by shareholders, they said that the proposal is very time-consuming and very expensive, and it would be contrary to the interest of the shareholders because obviously they have invested for a purpose and they want to receive their returns in doing so. So even though Exxon is seeking this relief in court, which is not sort of set to be dealt with anytime soon, their board meeting is on the 29th of May, which is next week, and we'll see what happens there. 2 things that are notable, the current position in terms of this matter is that shareholder activists have said that Exxon should have followed the usual process before the Securities and Exchange Commission, where they deal with shareholder proposal exclusion. So there's a whole process that they must follow as opposed to going to court. Then the other thing is the judge that's been appointed to deal with this matter is Judge Mark Pittman, and he sort of aired the view, well, if they've withdrawn their proposals, it's the matter not sort of moot, you know, where we're going with this. But in any event, that's where that is currently. Then, as a snowball effect normally happens, there are other shareholders who have also jumped on the bandwagon. So we have a shareholder called the California Public Employees Retirement System, and there's several others that have filed documents with the Securities and Exchange Commission protesting against Exxon's actions. And just to give you an idea, this retirement system, they only own 0.2% of Exxon shareholding, but they also are trying to encourage other shareholders to act against the board because they don't believe that it's right. So you've really got this this pull between, you know, proper climate change and what's really important for the investors. So as I said, the AGM is arranged for next week. We'll see what happens. But in short, the dispute really identifies the need to reduce greenhouse emissions, but also weighing up the interests of shareholders who expect a return. So I'll hand over to Adam now, who will deal with the similarities in terms of South African law.
Thanks. So the real question is how does that apply in South African law? And not in a dissimilar way. South African law, the primary source of shareholders' rights are the 2008 Companies Act and the Companies Memorandum of Incorporation, or MOI. Generally speaking, as Carmen alluded to, it's the director's role to control the day-to-day function of the company. And the shareholders' decisions are reserved for very specific and more fundamental decisions. So the typical ones are putting the company into winding up, amending the MOI, disposing of a greater part of the company's assets. But there's a provision in the Companies Act that says that any two shareholders can propose any resolution that they would exercise voting interest or voting rights on. So the question is, would the resolutions such as were proposed in the Exxon case be allowed to be proposed by shareholders in South Africa? And we don't know the answer yet because it hasn't gone to court. But to illustrate the sort of opposing views, there has been a recent example. A local shareholder activist called Just Share is the shareholder of Sasol, and they repeatedly proposed resolutions relating to climate change disclosures. And Sasol's board refused to propose them, saying that firstly, nothing in the MOI or the Companies Act allows them to propose those types of resolutions. And secondly, if the resolutions were actually adopted, it would encroach on the director's role as the day-to-day managers of the company. So apparently Just Share obtained a legal opinion from a very preeminent senior counsel in Joburg, which took a different view. His view was that Section 7 of the Companies Act enjoins the court to interpret the Companies Act in light of the Bill of Rights, that climate change is a serious human right, that due to the international movement towards disclosures and things like that, it's likely that a court will sort of give credence to that. Then the opinion concluded with saying that the likely result is that courts will firstly find that binding resolutions relating to disclosure on climate change would be allowed, and that non-binding resolutions going beyond mere disclosure would also be allowed. And whichever view will be preferred will ultimately be decided in court in due course. But whatever the case may be, we sort of see the consequence of the Exxon case as being more outside the courtroom than in the courtroom. Whether or not they're successful, there's been a massive public outcry about the case. And we think it's going to have a massive effect on market perception. And you can already see the trend of things like disruptions of AGMs, which took place with Sasol recently. Was it Standard Bank? Sasol, yeah, Sasol. Certain large investors such as Old Mutual and Adam Gray, exercising the rights to say we won't invest in companies that don't have a climate change commitment. And the recognition by regulators that, as Jess was talking about, to address ESG challenges. There's also little doubt that in future shareholders will resort to their rights in terms of the Companies Act and take matters on to court. So the question is, how does one manage that risk? And obviously we don't know all the answers, but a few things that have popped up is that the company should recognize that climate change is becoming more and more of a focal point. And that poor performance is likely to result in that company becoming a target for activist shareholders. Understand that shutting down the shareholders is probably not the best thing to do, but rather to engage with them, see if you can come to some sort of common ground. Consider having someone on the board who's actually tasked with climate change related issues, such as Standard Bank are now apparently doing. And lastly, to understand your institutional shareholders, your Allen Greys, your Old Mutuals, and to understand what their sort of wants are and their needs are. That's it for us. Yeah.
When green conduct gets a red card, and a couple of examples that I can think of is, financial services industry. We've heard all these scary stories about biodiversity and climate change, etc. So if an industry comes together and says, actually, let's say the financial services industry comes together and say, well, we're going to put a premium on rates for funding carbon intensive industries, or we're going to boycott funding carbon intensive industries. We are going to subsidize or give discounts, lower rates to green initiatives, etc., etc. Surely that's a great thing. We're all in this room and we want to say, yay, go for it. And I'm here to say, hold on, because the competition law may not allow you to do that. Okay. not going to go into all the examples that I used previously, but I'm here to tell you why the Competition Act is basically there to spoil, or can. It's not necessarily going to, but it can spoil the ESG part. Okay, so what we have in competition law, and I'm sure those of you have done some of our training or our presentations, is certain conduct that is outright prohibited under the Competition Act, and that is conduct between competitors, so agreements between competitors or concerted conduct between competitors that fixes prices, fixes trading terms, allocates markets, or bid rigging, but we're not concerned about that in this instance. So I'm going to unpack that a little bit for you so you can just see that when you are undertaking some of these initiatives, when you do them unilaterally, like Alan Gray saying we will not invest in these kinds of entities. When you do that on your own, that's fine. But when you do it as an industry, or when you get together with your competitor, that's when the difficulties arise. Okay. I'm also going to talk a little bit then about if you do find yourself in the situation where there is an industry cooperation or an alignment between the industry to pursue a certain conduct, all is not necessarily lost. There is an exemption route through the Competition Act. So, there isn't an ESG exemption, but there are other grounds that we think that we can massage ESG into getting an exemption for conduct, for laudable conduct, that is. So firstly, why would collaboration, why wouldn't an agreement in industry be necessary to pursue ESG goals? Can't we just all on our own pursue what we think is the right, or do the right thing? Because sometimes if you are pursuing doing the right thing, trying to do the right thing, you might find yourself at what we call a disadvantage, in the sense that, okay, I'm going to take a decision. I'm not going to use, I'm a grocery retailer. I'm not going to allow plastic packaging or non-biodegradable packaging anymore. I'm not going to buy those products. What's going to happen? You're going to pay more for products. You are going to become less competitive, in your offerings, and you may find that you are not the go-to. Consumers don't buy your products anymore because consumers are short-term thinkers generally, or love the environment, or yay, rah, rah for the environment. But if I have to pay 10 cents more for something that's environmentally friendly versus something that's packaged in a plastic bag that I'm going to put in a dustbin, or put it, people don't do that, particularly in South Africa, particularly in low-income countries. If I have to choose between feeding my children and saving the planet, I'm probably going to feed my children first. Okay. So certain things where you have this first mover disadvantage, where you're going to have a cost disadvantage or anything like that, you're not necessarily going to want to do on your own. And you might say, come on, industry, come with me. Let's do this together. And that's where you could potentially fall into the red card area. So there are definitely benefits to this collaboration. So we're not denying that. So you don't have that financial disadvantage. You have the certainty of everybody's working towards the same. So what are the red cards? Red cards are anything that affects price fixing, so rate fixing, for example, that would be anything that affects a trading term. In other words, saying we will not. And I'm going to pick on Jess today. I picked on poor Henry in Cape Town. Jess is a manufacturer, or she is a farmer. She uses horrible pesticides, and the industry says we're not going to use Jess's products anymore because really she's still damaging. She's she's killing. Having a negative effect on biodiversity. She is damaging our children's brains, all those kind of things. We are not going to use her input. Sounds like a good idea. Cannot do that. A group boycott, you can't do that under the Competition Act. So other types of conduct that we see and has attracted red cards overseas. establishment of joint ventures, where and it was specifically in packaging as well. Industry coming together and saying, let's greenify our packaging. Let's build let's get together. Let's put a joint venture in place, and we will only deal with a joint venture. That fixed a price. It was seen as fixing a price for a specific input of theirs. They're not buying from anybody else. It fixes their price. It affects their ability to, outside of the joint venture, compete with each other. Those can be the kind of red cards conduct. I'm going to talk a bit later. I mentioned about how we can work around that. Orange cards, in other words, oof, be careful, but it may be permissible, is what we consider in competition law under section 4.1a. It is a rule of reason test. It is what is the effect that the conduct has on competition, on the ability of entities to compete. And just so you know what competition is obviously about driving prices down, but it's also about consumer choice or customer choice for that matter, and innovation, diversity of products, etc., etc. So when you have conduct that leads to a substantial prevention or lessening of competition, you can defend that conduct if you can show that there are technological efficiency or other pro-competitive gains that arise from this. Now, there's nothing in that language in the Competition Act that speaks to ESG, but we do think that there is a possibility to massage in there to say, well, yes, this does decrease consumer choice, for example, but the gains that can come from that, the societal gains that come from that, are X, Y, and Z in terms of the green agenda. So we can work on something there. Green card, just so you know, not all industry collaborations are banned, so to speak. Setting industry standards under certain circumstances, where you still have the choice whether to comply with those industry standards. So the industry can set the standards and say, we would like to do this, but it's still each entity's individual decision whether they want to comply with that or not. And also particularly when the industry standards are set in an open and transparent way, everybody has the opportunity to make their contributions there. Should be okay. Information sharing. Now, information sharing has a very bad reputation in competition law, but if there is information sharing about Jess, who is, just saying, not going to, or saying, well, we're going to boycott a product, but just be aware that Jess poisons pollutes the rivers, etc. Just that kind of information sharing is generally seen as permissible. Internal conduct, such as as an industry, we are not if you are in the packaging industry as such, but let's say law firms got together and say we will only use recycled or recyclable consumables for our coffee machines and this, those kind of things. It doesn't affect our charge out rates or whether or not we actually provide services to anybody. So those kind of things are not are permissible. Those kinds of industry agreements are permissible. So I'm not going to go into the examples. I'm very, very conscious of time.
No, you're doing well. You've got 10 minutes.
Okay, well, that's great. Okay, so it's just a lot of examples of where there have been issues in the EU. So and maybe I can just say this, that we haven't seen it in South Africa yet. I'll talk about what we have seen in South Africa, but we haven't seen it in South Africa yet. But green initiatives, ESG, etc., is getting a lot of attention in Europe by the European Commission, the Competition Commission there. And they are looking very, very in great detail at green agreements and undertakings to promote green outcomes, but they're doing it through a skeptical lens. by saying, well, why can't you do this on your own? Is this something that you have to collaborate as an industry? Are you trying to mask some other anti-competitive conduct that you are engaging in by saying we have to collaborate? Are there fallouts in this collaboration? In other words, you know, you are collaborating on one thing, but actually that just creates a platform for you to collude in other areas. So looking at it through that, I mean, the very, very positive and very supportive of green initiatives, but they are skeptical about industry collaboration. So here in South Africa, what do we have to get us over the line here? We have you can go to the Competition Commission and apply to be exempt from the Competition Act in respect of certain conduct. And the categories of conduct that you can apply for an exemption is if it promotes employment, it promotes exports, it stops the decline in an industry. The conduct is necessary to promote small and medium enterprises or competition by firms owned by historically disadvantaged individuals, and it promotes economic efficiency, but to the extent that it also then promotes employment and economic growth. Those are the grounds, and ESG doesn't fit very, very clearly into those, but we do think that we have enough material to work with under stopping the decline in an industry, you know, changing the direction of an industry by becoming more sustainable through ESG initiatives, and then also the economic development and economic growth area. It'll take a bit of a massage, but, you know, they allowed in many years ago, and I think this, allowed co-chairs between Qantas and SAA because it promotes exports. So, you know, just because there was a flight, but, you know, whatever. So it worked there. Then very, very briefly, there's also, as you may know, and on the merger control, there's also public interest assessment that gets undertaken. Again, in that we think that we can massage some of the ESG principles in there. I'm not going to go into detail there. So under what we have seen is in the US, and very similar to, I think it's similar to the Exxon case. We're going to just shut them down. The shareholders are very litigious society, and they've all drunk the Kool-Aid of the you know, capitalism trucks. What we have seen there is where industries have come together to say, let's set standards, let's do something, let's promote the green initiative. Certain business people and certain competing industries have come up and said, but that's anti-competitive, you can't do that. So same way that I've explained how you can lead to an anti-competitive outcome. So it's not necessarily the competition authorities there, DOJ or the FTC, that's saying don't do that. It's actually competitors that say, well, we don't want to find ourselves unable to compete in the market because we don't have the green credentials, so that they then try to undermine those initiatives. So how do we mitigate risks for any kind of collaboration on green initiatives here? A compliance check-in, just get a sense of whether your conduct is potentially anti-competitive or falls within the section 41B, which doesn't have to have an anti-competitive effect, just needs to tick those boxes. Check in on that, do a compliance check-in with yourself. So when you are embarking on those initiatives, and then when we were, just as a closing remark, when we were thinking about what the topic should be, green card, red card type of thing. The other topic that we thought of was, you know, the road to hell. Have good intentions. So just remember that you might think you will be doing good, but you might find yourself in a bit of trouble under the Competition Act, and we are here to assist on that.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Faye. I am a trademark attorney in the Durban office, and IP is something I'm really passionate about, but I don't think many people realize the significant role IP actually plays in an organization. So if you take anything away from today, just remember that IP is very important. So I'll say something. So I'll be talking today about how IP assets can be leveraged for social and environmental change. And I think obviously a good starting point is to understand what IP actually is. So IP is a form of intangible property that comes from the creative endeavors of the mind. And it includes a whole host of things. It includes ideas, logos, trademarks, computer programs, software programs, research and development data, innovations. The list really goes on. That's just a few of the highlights under IP law. But the important thing to note is that IP is actually an asset. And like any other asset in a company, it has value in the marketplace. So the S&P 500 is a stock market index that tracks the performance of some of the largest companies on various stock exchanges in the United States. So this graph is an assessment of IP assets in proportion to non-IP assets in a business. So you'll note from this graph that in 1975, 17% of the value in a company resided in their IP assets. And as you can see from the graph, there is an upward trajectory. And in 2020, 90% of the value in a company resided in their IP assets. So quite significant. And what this tells us is that the largest asset of a company is in fact in their IP. So just to bring it back home, just looking at some rankings. So Brand Finance is a ranking agency that ranks the top most valuable brands across the world annually in various countries. So this is just the top 10 most valuable South African brands for 2024. So some very popular, common partners up here, many of which ENS does a lot of work for. You'll see Investex up there with an estimated value of 19.9 billion rand. So that is the brand value for just Investex on its own. So regardless of any what we call corporeal or tangible assets, that is the value of just the Investex name on its own. And then taking the number one spot is MTN with an estimated brand value of 68.2 billion rand. So this just puts into perspective the value of what a brand or the capacity of a brand has to create value in the commercial space and in our marketplace. So as mentioned before, there's various types of IP. There's statutory IP, non-statutory IP. So I think I'll just run quickly through the various types of IP, just so that we have a little bit of an overview on what each type of IP right comprises of. So this example of a pharmaceutical product is a nice example because it shows the interplay with how a single product can have various different aspects of IP. So starting with trademarks, and as a trademark attorney, naturally I would start with trademarks. So a trademark is what we call a source identifier or a badge of origin. So it's essentially an element that a consumer encounters that identifies that that particular product emanates from a particular source. A good trademark is one which is not descriptive of the goods, is not generic or reasonably required for use in the trade by other parties. So in this particular example, the trademark in question would be the name, Fevral, because that's what consumers would identify as a source origin. Copyright subsists in work. So there's various different types of works protected under copyright law. There's literary works, artistic works, sound recordings, films, etc. In this particular example, copyright can be seen in the federal stylized element as an artistic work, but also in the packaging layout of this particular product as an artistic work. In a pharmaceutical product such as this, you typically have a product insert in the packaging, which lists various sort of technical information, and that would be protected as a literary work under copyright law. Patents and designs are a little bit more technical and complicated areas of IP law, and I'll just touch briefly on what each of them are. So a patent essentially protects how something works. So something that is new, novel, and it would protect the mechanism on how it operates. So, for example, in this particular pharmaceutical product, if the formulation of the drug was quite unique, innovative, and not commonplace in the market, it would be protectable as patent. A registered design protects the way something looks. So you get aesthetic designs and you get functional designs. An aesthetic design would protect an element of a product purely for its aesthetic purposes. So, for example, if it has a unique feature, if it's shaped in a unique way, it's protectable by a design in terms of an aesthetic design. But if that particular shape or design achieves a function, then it would be protectable as a functional design. So in a pharmaceutical product or tablet product, a common example I can think of is the Panado packaging, which has a particular shape in the container. It's a functional design because it's created that way as a child safety mechanism. Sorry about it. Yeah, so that would be a functional design.
Okay.
And then moving on to other forms of IP, non-statutory IP, which is know-how, confidential information, and trade secrets. Those are particularly levels of IP that deal with information that's used to create a particular product that's not known to other parties. And then just to give you an example of the non-statutory IP, and some popular examples we know of is the secret recipe for KFC, for example, that's a trade secret. And the formula for Coca-Cola, nobody knows how that's produced, so that's also a trade secret. So moving on to SDGs. So in 2015, the SDGs were created as a global pledge to support sustainable development. And as you guys know, there has been an increase in our focus on SDGs in various organizations, and IP has been at the center of it. So throughout history, when faced with challenges, it has been human beings' ingenuity, innovation, and creativity that has helped us overcome and succeed when faced with global challenges. From electric vehicles to life-changing drugs, AI, digital technologies, we've seen that IP can be the vehicle that turns ideas into real-world impact. So ESG and IP have particularly been our focus this year. And World IP Day was celebrated on the 26th of April. And the theme this year was IP and SDGs, building our common future with innovation and creativity. So as part of the initiative this year for World IP Day, participants were encouraged to submit videos to show how IP and the use of innovation in their communities are contributing to the SDGs. And I'd just like to play a few videos for you, just one video compiling all the winners of this year's competition, just to demonstrate the interplay between IP and ESG and how we can implement that in our organizations and in our daily lives.
As Alex's gadget and Maya's music gain popularity, their intellectual property rights become invaluable assets, opening doors for new opportunities and collaborations. Thanks to the benefits of intellectual property, Alex and Maya were able to turn their dreams into reality.
My ideas are changing the industry. My idea will elevate the society.
My ideas are changing lives.
Your ideas will change the world.
As Alex's gadget and Maya's music gain popularity, their intellectual property rights become invaluable assets, opening doors for new opportunities and collaborations. Thanks to the benefits of intellectual property, Alex and Maya were able to turn their dreams into reality.
My ideas are changing the industry. My idea will elevate the society.
My ideas are changing lives.
Your ideas will change the world.
O homem Henrique tem 28 anos e baixa visão. Graças à inovação dessa jovem equipe, foi possível ter uma dimensão mais real da Mona Lisa.
Lábios são rosados e possuem um sorriso leve e suave.
Foi uma experiência legal, né, de tocar essa escultura da Mona Lisa.
Os responsáveis pela emoção em João Henrique são alunos de uma escola técnica da cidade de Sobral. Eles integram a equipe Bibotes e criaram um protótipo da Mona Lisa com uma nobre missão: tornar a arte mais acessível.
Nosso protótipo ele consiste em uma impressão 3D de alto relevo e, além disso, tem um meio tecnológico. Quando o sensor detecta o toque, ele envia essa mensagem para o Arduino, que, por sua vez, envia para o alto-falante.
O projeto inovador conquistou o primeiro lugar na etapa regional do torneio de robótica da First Level League. Agora, a equipe está aperfeiçoando o protótipo para disputar a competição nacional.
Experiência muito boa, inovadora, que proporciona a esses meninos o protagonismo.
Enquanto se prepara para a nova competição, a equipe já trabalha em um novo protótipo, a do Cristo Redentor. E mesmo muito jovens, os participantes sabem o quanto a propriedade intelectual é importante e, por isso, o registro do programa de computador utilizado já foi solicitado.
A gente quer tentar, pelo menos, patentear o nosso projeto e levar de forma global.
As first parts.
Welcome to the world of Koyamo, where play meets learning to empower Africa's children. Koyamo is a digital platform we designed to make learning playful, accessible, and measurable for every single child across Africa, breaking down barriers one lesson at a time.
I am Shade. You'll find me and my adventures on Koyamo.
Through Shade Stories, we're reimagining our culture, preserving our heritage, and sparking a love for learning.
It's an all new way to learn and dream big, right?
We are passionate about SDG4, ensuring every child has the opportunity to learn, to thrive, and to succeed. Intellectual property rights protect our innovations, enabling us to share Koyamo and Shade stories with children everywhere.
Join us in celebrating World IP Day as we use creativity and IP to build a better future for all learners. With Koyamo,
dreams become
reality. Happy World IP Day!
I live in a small historical kampung named Kauman. Kau means people. People in here work as batik makers since 18th century. From painting using hot liquid wax with canting to coloring with natural dyes, we create motifs that symbolize Indonesian local culture and philosophies. We proudly making batik that everyone can use for wedding, praying, and daily occasion. As a young batik enthusiast, I realized that batik is my true calling. I need to protect my culture as well as environment. I develop more contemporary batik motifs using stamp technique in many kinds of surfaces to foster production and make it easier to learn for young generation while keeping the traditions of using natural ingredients for coloring batik. By having intellectual property protection, Kalman's batik has opportunity to grow far and wide. It opens a new fashion forward by promoting Indonesian culture to the world. They align with sustainable development mission now and forevermore.
So looking particularly at leveraging IP assets in the financial sector is uniquely positioned to help with ESG goals because they kind of control capital flow and investments. So by prioritizing investments in companies and technologies that adhere to ESG principles, financial institutions can incentivize businesses to adopt more sustainable and ethical practices. This then creates a ripple effect, encouraging industries to innovate and operate with a greater sense of responsibility towards society and the environment. So just touching on a few aspects of IP and ESG. So one of the ways we can use IP in the financial sector is through green technology patents. So financial institutions can, through strategic investments and funding, support the development of patented technologies that are aimed at reducing environmental impact, thereby contributing to ESG goals. And with trademarks, aligning trademarks with social responsibility inspires a broader cultural shift. So if we consider things like financial products associated with social empowerment, empowering underserved communities, by building and protecting brands that emphasize social good, you're not only enhancing the reputation in your organization, but also fostering a culture of inclusivity. And lastly, making use of ESG in the development of financial products. So using patented algorithms and models can be used to create investment strategies that prioritize ESG factors. So when making choices as to where to make your investments, have software or algorithms that evaluate companies based on ESG factors in terms of their carbon footprint, labor practices, etc. So we can make more responsible and informed decisions. Just touching on some of the benefits of leveraging IP assets as tools for social and environmental change. So as mentioned earlier, IP promotes innovation, economic growth, environmental sustainability, and social inclusion. It also offers financial rewards, motivating inventors to create new solutions to address the global problems that we face. IP and ESG promotes responsible and ethical business practices. Also, enforcing IP prevents infringement and misappropriation of sustainable innovation. It fosters collaboration and partnerships. Often we see different stakeholders coming together with different skill sets to collaborate and come up with different ideas and innovations, inventions that are for our better, for the environment's benefit. Protecting your brand increases consumer awareness and increases brand reputation simply by being associated with ESG. And protecting your IP obviously reduces risks and it gives you long-term benefit from your investment. So just something I wanted to read for you guys just on the role of IP and ESG as said by WIPO, which is the World Intellectual Property Organization. It deals with IP strategy and the role of IP and ESG. And it essentially says that an effective IP strategy can differentiate an organization from its competitors. A successful ESG strategy will often require substantial investment in the development of innovative technologies. An organization must ensure that material IP rights are developed and that they are appropriately protected in a manner that aligns with the organization's broader goals. Securing registered IP rights is not only an important step in ensuring that the organization can recoup its investment in innovation, but it can also facilitate partnerships and collaborations amongst companies, which can in turn lead to more effective solutions in overcoming environmental and social challenges. So just to wrap up, a few key considerations for you to consider when developing your IP ESG strategy. First and foremost is to protect your IP. So that would include registering your trademarks. Obviously, there is a lot of time, investment, resources, money being put into the development of particular brands, and you want to protect your investment, especially because all that time, energy, finances is being spent on building a reputation in that particular brand. So without any protection, you would often be faced with very limited remedies in terms of infringement. Secondly is to ensure that your branding is not misleading or deceptive in that it does not contain any unsubstantiated environmental claims or sustainability claims. Thirdly is to safeguard any ESG-related technologies, because without patent rights, companies would be hesitant to invest their finances in the research and development of those IP rights without being able to recoup their investment. Thirdly is to enforce IP rights, particularly to ensure that the standard of quality of the products being produced or services offered are adequately protected. So you don't want people to pass off your particular product or your service as theirs when they don't have the quality associated with you. And then lastly, to consider appropriate licensing strategies. And this goes back to the point earlier about collaboration and partnership, where we often see different stakeholders coming together at the same table with different skill sets to innovate and create solutions for the betterment of our planet. And then lastly, just on a few steps that we can take to align our IP practices with ESG within an organization. Obviously, conduct regular IP audits to see what is being created in your business, whether that's whether the creations or innovations in the business are capable of being protected as IP, but also for you to understand what IP already sits in the business. So you can have a sense of the value of those particular IP intellectual property products. And then secondly, to have relevant IP policies in place to ensure that members of a particular organization are aligned with the values of that particular organization and the policies and channels to follow in the event of new IP being created to ensure that it's protected. And then lastly, just to report on IP practices. This is just for transparency and good governance of the business to ensure compliance with ESG principles.
Type project. So these can also be financed under sustainability bonds if it also finances a social project. And under sustainability linked bonds, your KPIs can be blue linked KPIs. But in its purest form, a blue bond is a green bond that will finance blue projects. So here, going back to our first picture, the proceeds will be used to finance a blue project. Otherwise, it works exactly the same. If you finance a green project, obviously, it will be finance. A little arrow there would be green. Okay, so before we go into the legals, I really just want to give you a quick snapshot of the market to show you the size of its market. So according to the World Bank, the total amount of sustainable bonds issued globally reached 4.9 trillion last year. And I think it's up to 5.3 trillion this year so far. And then S&P Global Ratings gave the outlook for the sustainable bond market for 2024. And the report forecasts that new sustainable bond issuances will reach between $950 billion and $1.05 trillion during 2024. And that this could represent 14% of total bond issuance in 2024. So that would include conventional bonds. So 14% of the total market. And that's significantly up from 5% in 2019. So it's shown a lot of growth since then. Then I would also like to mention that the green bonds really dominated the market at 59% last year. And that's also what we've seen in previous years. That was followed by social bonds, 18%, sustainability bonds at 16%, and sustainability-linked bonds at 7%. Now, of these green bonds, some of them also comprise blue bonds. And blue bonds to date, as of December last year, 6.8 billion worth of blue bonds were issued. And this was since 2019 when the first blue bond was issued. Now, going to the next slide, you'll see that Europe really dominated the market, held 45% market share last year. And that's pretty much consistent with what we've seen in previous years. Africa and the Middle East only held 2% market share. And that's up from 1% in previous years since 2019. Now, S&P does expect that emerging markets will show a bit of an upturn this year. So hopefully we'll see the 2% rise this year. Now, from a legal perspective, what must we do to get this 2% up? What must issuers do in terms of our market to issue green bonds and blue bonds and any type of sustainable bonds? Now, in South Africa, for you to issue a bond, that bond will typically be issued in compliance with the Companies Act, the Banks Act, and the Commercial Paper Regulations. Now, none of these pieces of legislation deal with the issuance of sustainable bonds at all. We don't have any legislation dealing specifically with it. So for that reason, we need to look a bit wider and we need to see what's done internationally. Now, the International Capital Markets Association, or ICMA, published the green bond principles, the social bond principles, the sustainability bond principles, and the sustainability-linked bond principles. And in September last year, they also issued a guide to blue bonds that must be read in conjunction with these principles. Now, according to ICMA, 98% of all sustainable bond issuances comply with these principles. So these are really the market standard. Now, these principles aim to really focus on transparency and disclosure, and they really aim to combat practices such as greenwashing, which would be where an issuer will misrepresent the greenness of its product. And ICMA really aims to combat that really by disclosure and continued reporting, so that you know what you're investing and that you know what your funds are being used towards. So I'm going to go into ICMA now, but I think it's important to mention that the JSE recently established the sustainability segment of the interest rate market. Now, on this segment, you can issue sustainable instruments, so sustainable bonds, any type of green bond, blue bond, anything like that can be issued specifically on that market.
Previous one.
Yeah. So in terms of the debt listing requirements of a JSE, you must comply with the ICMA requirements if you want to list on the sustainability market. So although not technically law, if you want to list one of these instruments, which will typically be done, you do need to comply with the ICMA principles. The Cape Town Stock Exchange also recently made proposed amendments to their listing requirements, also suggesting that these principles be incorporated and that if you want to issue on the sustainability market, you must comply with these principles. So if you want to issue a blue bond or a green bond under these principles, you'll really need to comply with the 4 main components of the ICMA principles. And these are use of proceeds, process for project evaluation and selection, management of proceeds, and reporting. On the use of proceeds, the proceeds of the bond must be used specifically towards an eligible green or blue project. And this project must comply with certain environmental objectives. So according to ICMA, their main objectives are climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, natural resource conservation, biodiversity conservation, and pollution prevention and control. So your project must comply with certain environmental objectives for it to be qualified as green or blue. Then under process for project evaluation and selection. So you must communicate to your investors what you're doing. You must communicate to them what these objectives are that you want to comply with. It must show how you determine that the project will fall within a certain green or blue projects. Any complementary type of information, such as the risks associated with your project, and alignment with taxonomies. So I think Jess mentioned taxonomies earlier. So any alignment with taxonomies. So that's the second component. The third component is management of proceeds. So the proceeds you receive from the bond issuance must be ring-fenced to your project, really. It can be credited to a sub-account, or it can be moved to a sub-portfolio, and it must really be used towards that specific project. And that application of funds must be tracked by the issuer. Then the final component, reporting. So the issuer must do annual reporting on how they applied these funds, the project to which they applied it to, what objectives they met, the expected impact. So it must do that continued reporting. So you'll see that there's definite disclosure requirements, and you must really ring-fence these amounts really towards a specific project. Then in addition to these 4 core components, ICMA also recommended that bond frameworks be prepared and that external reviews be done. Now, bond frameworks they're usually publicly available. They can be contained in a separate document or in your legals. So if you issue a bond, you'll usually have a placing document that's publicly available, and a sum of information can be incorporated into that placing document, and it will really show how you've complied with these 4 components of the ICMA principles. It will also show what the issuer's overarching environmental objectives are and how they've used relevant taxonomies. Now, issuers will look at this report when they make their investment decision. They'll base all of their due diligence really on this report. Then external reviews. There can be pre-issuance reviews and post-issuance reviews. So under pre-issuance reviews, there's usually an independent third-party reviewer that will double check basically if an issuer complied with the 4 components of ICMA principles. And this will most commonly be called a second-party opinion. Now, this is a recommendation of ICMA, but it is required by the debt listing requirements. So if you list on the JSE, you must have a sub opinion, second party opinion. Post issuance, it's also recommended that the auditors or another third party verify the application of the funds and really the tracking of the funds, how it's been applied, but again, that continued reporting. And investors will look at this, they'll look at the pre-issuance report, post-issuance reports, or to really see what they're investing in. And again, this goes far towards combating greenwashing. It really gives credibility to the market and to bonds, and really opens the field for new investment. Now, going back to our first core component, so that the proceeds must be used to fund an eligible project that complies with environmental objectives. ECMA does specify certain, it does list certain blue projects that they see will comply with these objectives. You can see them on the screen here. So it's renewable energy, combating green solutions, sustainable ports, and lists a whole lot of them. This is a non-exhaustive list and it's really indicative. So ECMA recommends that you do use taxonomies. So in conjunction with the ECMA principles, they suggest that you use taxonomies. Now, in these taxonomies, in this context, it really defines what these type of projects are in a lot of detail. So again, that will give your investors comfort for if I see that you complied with a certain taxonomy, they know that, okay, that project will be green, blue, whatever they say it will be. So like Jess mentioned, we do have the South African Sustainable Finance Initiative, issued the South African Green Finance Taxonomy when was it, in 2022. And it's almost 200 pages of definitions of projects, and it's very, very technical, contains a lot of words that I don't understand. But that will really define what your project is. Is it green? What type of project? Is it blue? And so you'll really read the ECMA principles with this taxonomy. And so when you want to issue a bond in SA, you'll comply with the Companies Act, the Banks Act, and the Commercial Paper Regulations as you would with any other bond. If you want to list it, you'll have a look at the debt listing requirements. And then, of course, also the ECMA principles and the taxonomy. So that's basically in a nutshell what you do in SA if you want to issue a blue bond. Now, we haven't seen a blue bond, to my knowledge, in SA yet. We've seen a lot of green bonds, but not a blue one yet. So hopefully soon. So colleagues in Cape Town are working on a blue bond that's going to be issued in Namibia in December. And that's been in the news. It's called Kelp Blue. It's a very exciting opportunity. They farm kelp just off the coast in Namibia, and that will be funded by way of blue bond. So that's something exciting to keep an eye out for. So I think that's me for today. I think we're also out of time, Jay.
Yes, we are.
Thank you so much. If you've got any questions.
Everyone, like Jess said, my name is Mia Bevan. I work in our corporate commercial department here in Durban. I will be speaking to you guys about ESG in relation to due diligences. I have been specializing in corporate commercial for about 15 years now. I've run quite a few large DDs for ENS over the years. So, yeah, this is something I am familiar with. I'm sure you guys all know, but just quickly, a DD basically is an investigation into an entity to either identify risks if you are looking at buying another company or a business, or it can also be a self-assessment to see where you can improve or where you are heading and where you want to head, anything like that. So traditionally, DDs focus on finance, tax, legal, and compliance. Now, these broad sort of categories do touch lightly on ESG, environmental, especially employment, BEE, and then anti-corruption do get touched on, but it's not a very deep sort of dive into these or into ESG. So we do, considering the trend towards ESG lately or recently, we do recommend that you look at or consider a standalone ESG DD component if you are, like I said, either doing a self-assessment or buying into an entity. Okay, Barbs, I think you can move on there for me. Okay, so what are the consequences if you decide not to do an ESG due diligence? Currently, there isn't any legislation which places a requirement on you. I think Jess has chatted to you about Regulation 28 already, so that's the only sort of piece of legislation we have in South Africa dealing with this. So, I mean, if you decide not to do it, there's no penalties, there's no fines, there's nothing. But obviously, there are risks involved, although they're not legal, there are risks involved in not doing an ESG DD, and those are mostly reputational risks, financial losses, I mean, depreciation of your shares, etc., etc. So like that's the risks of not doing a DD. But let's say you decided to do a DD, how can it help you? Obviously, you can find a big red flag and you can decide we do not want to go ahead with buying this entity. Or you can say, okay, well, it is a red flag, but it's not a deal breaker for us. Let's just reduce our price, offer a slightly lesser price. You can also require the seller to give you certain indemnities to cover your areas of concern. And then the last thing you could possibly do is also place on certain conditions on your deal. They need to do certain things. They need to implement certain policies, etc., etc. Okay. Okay, so like I said in the previous slides, if you decide to do a ESG DD, these are some of the advantages, but I mean, they're not specific to an ESG DD. These are the general ones for doing a DD. I mean, but the main ones are identifying your risks if you are buying into another company, or if you're doing a self-assessment, is where are your areas for improvement? What can you improve? And that obviously then helps you to make decisions. I mean, we all know you need information in order to make a decision. And that is the big reason for a DD. Okay, what are the global trends? What's happening outside of South Africa regarding ESG and DD? Like the first bullet point says here, the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive was adopted recently, requiring large EU and non-EU companies as well to conduct human rights and environmental DDs. Now, it is going to be implemented in phases, and the first stage is only by 2027, so it's still very early days. But non-compliance can lead to penalties and fines, etc. So, although this is not South African related, I mean, it is something that you do need to take into consideration if you're buying an entity that deals cross-border. Then the next thing is the French Duty of Diligence Act, and that came in in 2017, and France was actually the first country to bring in any sort of this type of legislation. And that's self-assessment, or all of these are actually self-assessment DDs. And that requires large companies to carry out a human rights and an environmental DD and then have a plan, publish a plan annually how to deal with these issues. And then the last one is the OECD due diligence guidelines for responsible business conduct. So it's not specifically dealing with ESG, but it has an ESG portion to it. And once again, self-assessment and identifying all the aspects you need to deal with. Then in South Africa, what is happening in South Africa? The trends in South Africa. Once again, like I said in the beginning, there's no binding legislation, but we are sort of moving towards something. The first thing is in 2020, the JSE introduced the Sustainability Disclosure Guideline. Now that gives JSE listed companies guidelines on certain things to include in their reporting, which is mainly sustainability and climate. Once again, not mandatory though. And then Jess has talked to you about the IFRS S1 and S2, which is also sort of shows where we are moving towards. Okay. Next one, guys. Okay, so here we get to what Jess was saying, what I was going to talk to be is, okay, so we've decided we want to do an ESG due diligence, a standalone one. What do we ask? What are the questions that we ask? And this is the favorite attorney response, that it depends. Okay, so what do you as a client want out of it? How much money are you willing to be spending or want to spend? And then what sector if you're doing self-assessment, what sector are you in? And if you're buying another company, what sector is that company in? And that will then all determine what specific questions we ask around ESG. Although, like I said, it is sector specific, there are some general questions that would be asked across the board. And one of the examples that we have is that the New Companies Act is coming in, not the New Companies Act. The New Companies Act has been in place since 2018, but there are a few amendments to it, and some of them are regarding remuneration and your transparency and disclosures regarding that. And one of the questions that we could ask is, are you ready for that? Are you ready to make all those disclosures if it does come in the next year or so? Then I think you guys have been addressed by a few people dealing with specific sectors. So what we have in the next few slides is we have taken a few sectors and given you a few examples of what we would ask for that sector. So the first one is fashion or consumer goods, and then the next one we're going to talk about is banking and finance, and then the last one is construction. So here, like I said, we've given you a few examples of questions that would be in your DD question list that you give to either the company that you want to buy or that you as the company itself pull in. So as an example is how do you source your raw materials? So if you are the manufacturer itself, how do you source your raw materials? Or if you are if you are as Mr. Price or selling the garments, you have to check your suppliers. Where do you get your raw materials from? Where do you source it? Is it sustainably sourced, etc., etc.? Then another thing, and this is once again where the different DDs overlap, is environmental. Do your manufacturers comply with all their environmental permits? Which is an important one, quite often raises red flags in DDs because they are not complying with their environmental permits. How are materials, that's like I've touched on those, sustainable materials and production processes. So what is your carbon footprint? Are you sourcing locally? What are you doing with your excess materials? Are you giving it to community projects close to you? Are you helping with training locally on sort of things that you are in the industry with, like what are those examples that we have? Low carbon product manufacturing, etc., etc. Important one for fashion is how do you have policies in place to prevent child or forced labor? Yeah, all these type of things. Environmental impact during, yeah, that last one. Just going back. Your environmental impact during production and transportation is important. Yeah, etc. Then banking and finance. The first one here is, what processes and policies do you have in place to help your management with ESG to identify, assess, and then implement, you know, areas that you have identified that are a risk area? If you're looking at your credit analysis, do you take into account ESG factors? If you are doing your FICA or your know your client processes, do you take into consideration ESG and that entity's commitment to ESG? Does the entity require whoever is supplying them on their value chain, do they require information, ESG information from that entity, and then use that to make decisions? Yeah, just a few questions on banking and finance. And then the last one on construction, I think very similar to the consumer goods one we discussed. Once again, labor is a big one. Your source of labor, is it local? Your materials that you source, sustainable, where do you source it from? How is it sourced? Other things, once again, environmental things like waste management, do they comply with all the environmental permits? What environmental risks have been identified in either the entity or their projects, and how are they dealing with that? And then another thing is also, which is more in your HR related sphere, is what incidents have you had lately? Have they been recordable? Were they fatal? And were they for your own employees or your subcontractors' employees? Those type of things we look at in the construction. And so, like I said, Jess, this is, I mean, very quick, because it is a sort of a new thing, but we as ENS have tried, or have not tried, we have established a standalone ESG questionnaire. So we are ready for clients that want to do that as a standalone DD part. And I think this is sort of just for a summary of what we have discussed is, when you're looking at a DD, what do we look at to tailor it? And like I said, the starting point is the sector. What do you want as a client, and how much can you pay? And that will obviously determine the scope of the DD. And then what do you get out of your DD report is you as an entity can make informed decisions about where you want to go. And I mean, we've dealt with all these in the previous one, what you can do with your contracting, warranties, indemnities, conditions, etc. Yeah, and I think the last thing to sort of emphasize is that because ESG is a new area and it can get lost in a DD, is that if you decide to do an ESG DD, is appoint a specific person to deal with that DD in your entity. That is dealing with a standalone focus by itself, not as part of environmental or employment or whatever the case may be. And then on the converse, have for your target entity, have the same thing. Have it identify, is that generally something, is ESG generally something that they have been dealing with? If so, is there a specific person that has been dealing with ESG? That obviously can streamline the process, and then drill down into your specifics and deal with that person. Yeah, so
Thank
that
you,
is me.